everyone, and welcome to Resistance Live for the last day of April 2025. And today we have to talk about this absolutely bonkers interview that Trump gave to Terry Moran on ABC last night that was supposed to be favorable to him. Terry Moran is kind of known to be a relatively conservative journalist. And obviously, the interview did not go as Trump had intended. Many of you have probably already seen the clips related to this, but the interview itself was just a real insight into Trump's current state of mind. And there's a number of things that we need to talk about in relation to it, partially because there were a lot of people who were like shocked at some of the things that Trump did, which if you've been hanging around here for a while and you've heard me talk about the way narcissistic abuse functions, probably were not quite so shocking to you, but we're going to talk about it anyway. Today, for our visually challenged viewers, I'm wearing a brown top with a black blazer over top. My hair is down. I'm a pink-skinned, green-eyed, dirty, blonde-haired woman. I'm in front of my bookshelf and my yellow utility cart, and I'm coming to you, as always, from occupied Muncie, Lenape, and Mohegan land, right outside of the great city of New York. Okay, my friends. So yesterday, Trump gave this ABC interview with Terry Moran as the interviewer. And in the middle of it, well, there were a number of really kind of like bizarre moments. The most bizarre one that is getting a lot of airplay is a 2.5 minute window of time where Trump absolutely refused to consider or even state that the picture that he had held up in the Oval Office that was allegedly of Abrego Garcia's knuckles had been photoshopped. Now, I'm just going to say something. If you have looked at this photo, what was held up by Donald Trump in the Oval Office, it is probably the worst Photoshop that I've ever seen. Like, there's literally no question that what somebody did was simply like take a typeface and stamp MS13 across the photograph. It does not look like a tattoo. It does not look like it is on his skin. It is perhaps the worst instance of Photoshop that like we've ever been exposed to in the American public. Nonetheless, Trump got incredibly irate when Terry Moran called him on the carpet and said he doesn't have those tattoos on his hands. We've seen the photographs of him in Venezuela. His hands don't say that. This photo is in dispute. It's photoshopped. Trump lost his mind and literally said, I chose you as my interviewer. Why don't you just say yes? Now, this went on for 2.5 minutes. And one of the things that was kind of even more sort of bizarre about it was that Terry Moran throughout this entire 2.5 minutes was trying to move on to the topic of Ukraine. And Trump would not let it go. He kept reverting back like 3 or 4 times to this issue of the photograph, allegedly, of Abrego Garcia's hand. And so lots of people on the interwebs last night were just, this is insane. How could he possibly say this? Why won't he just admit that the photo was doctored? It's so obvious. This is, he has pudding for brains. Okay, so we have to take a moment here and just pause. Because as I said at the top, Jen just made me laugh. Her comment is, tattoos aren't usually in Arial font. Correct. One of the things that, as I said at the top, we have to consider here is what kind of an insight this gives us into Trump's psychopathology, because I was not surprised by this. And frankly, I had a moment when I was watching all of this go down on Blue Sky where I was like, why are all of these white men so stunned? And all of these journalists who are white men so stunned at the fact that Trump is doing this over and over and over again? Because for me, it was a very familiar kind of experience. And I suspect for anyone who has ever been involved in a relationship of any kind with a malignant narcissist, parent, spouse, friend, coworker, boss, you know exactly what this is. So let me just explain a couple of things to you that everybody should be familiar with here. And I'm explaining these because I think it actually makes our capacity to tolerate these kind of moments bigger, right? Because if we have an intellectual understanding of why he's doing this, it's a lot easier to not sit in that space of like, oh my God, the president is nuts, right? So let's just talk about this for a second. The first thing we know about Donald Trump is that he is literally a pathological liar, not in the kind of like expression version of it, but like pathologically compelled to lie because of his malignant narcissism. Okay. One of the things that we know about malignant narcissists is that they have a deep pit of nothingness inside their soul. Basically, they know deep down and believe deep down that they are completely worthless as human beings. By the way, if you've ever been in a relationship with a narcissist and you've seen this moment unmasked, you know how scary it can actually be. It's happened to me maybe twice in my life where I've witnessed a malignant narcissist in complete meltdown, where that portion of them becomes prominent and the kind of like veil of what they pretend to be goes down. It's terrifying, okay? They will go to any length, and I do mean that, any length, to avoid any kind of public recognition of the fact that they believe themselves to be totally worthless. And that means that they will stay committed by their very fingernails to the deepest, most bizarre lies if telling the truth would reveal that they had made a mistake. So what's the lay of the land here in terms of the actual facts? Well, Trump deported 230 plus odd men to a concentration camp without due process. We know as a fact that quite a large number of these men have never been accused of a crime. We know that all of them were denied the opportunity to appear before a judge and even present evidence as to whether or not they were in the country on documented status, undocumented status, whether or not they had any gang affiliation, whether or not there was literally any basis whatsoever to remove them from the country. What Donald Trump did in this regard was incredibly inhumane, monstrous. And if he admits that he made a mistake in like the most prominent public example of this, that of Abrego Garcia, father in Maryland, hardworking union man who is in the country, not doing anything criminal, paying taxes, taking care of his family, raising his kids, no gang affiliation whatsoever. If Trump admits that there was no basis to deport that man, then he has to be confronted in his own psychopathology with the truth of who he is. And rather than allow any tiny crack to appear in that veneer, he will hold fast to the most disputable lies in order to preserve the idea that he is not what he actually is. Okay. So he's trying desperately to prevent anyone from having a basis to admit that he was wrong, let alone monstrous. And that's the reason why he's lying. And, one of the things I said last night on Blue Sky, just in case you want like a more kind of like intimate personal example of this, is I know someone for whom there's literally like recorded 911 tape of his wife screaming into 911 that he had hit her, where he denies the entire event ever took place. Literally recorded audio tape, denies the whole thing ever took place. And that's because to admit that there had even been a 911 call or that he had actually committed domestic violence against his wife would be to reveal the truth of who he is. Okay. So this is a regular, predictable pattern of malignant narcissist. Nobody should be shocked by this. Okay. If you know anything about malignant narcissism. The other thing that we have to talk about in relation to this that is just really critical for people to understand, and we haven't done a deep dive on this inside this broadcast, even in the last 8.5 years that we've been doing this, but let me just like put it on the record. Okay. There is a documented phenomenon called narcissistic amnesia. Okay. And it's where narcissists essentially split. I posted an article from Psychology Today about this last night on Blue Sky if you want to go a little deeper. But it is about the fact that sometimes when they have done horrific things and they can't confront the fact that they've done horrific things, they actually, their brain, as what is essentially a defense mechanism, splits that memory off and buries it. Okay, so this is how men, for instance, who are malignant narcissists, who have committed domestic violence against their spouse, their partner, a family member, can credibly show up in court and claim that they never did it, right? And I wouldn't say credibly because there's always evidence, but nonetheless, will claim that they have no memory whatsoever. Will wake up the next morning after an event like that and say, I don't know what you're talking about. You're making this all up. And fully believe it. Okay. So when people wonder how Trump can, for instance, say things like, I never said that, when there's actual tape of him saying that, I never made that point. Let's roll the tape. That's because he is experiencing delusional amnesia, actually a feature of malignant narcissism. His brain is literally not allowing him to remember all the horrible things that he did. This is also how he can claim that like raping E. Jean Carroll was completely fabricated out of nowhere when a jury found him to be an adjudicated rapist. So this is something that people need to be aware of when you're watching what's going down, okay? Because it's a lot easier from the standpoint of our own self-regulation in response to these kind of events to be like, here he goes again. We know what this is. It's exactly part of the same pattern. I will point out, however, that I think there is still, to this day, a huge failure in mainstream journalism to not actually talk about this stuff. The reason why we have all these white male journos running around going like, I can't believe he did this crazy thing, is because nobody is actually reporting on the nature of malignant narcissism in its symptomology. Because if the general public and big name reporters had an understanding of what this actually was, it would be much easier to dismantle it. We wouldn't waste all this time going like, he's insane. How can he possibly stay so committed to that lie? We could instead be saying, this is an example about why this man can't be in office and he has to be removed, right? That would be the way to go with it. So, all of this put together is something that we need to kind of like consider when we look at the lens of what he's doing. Now, I want to add one other layer to this because I think it's really important, okay? And we have some very significant breaking news on the deportation of folks generally that I'm going to get to in a minute. But I want to point something else out. One of the things about a malignant narcissist is that they are very easily manipulated, okay? When they have somebody in their camp who praises them nonstop, says, you're doing a great job, the public loves this. No, the economy isn't bad. I'll just point out that in last night's interview, he also claimed that the economy wasn't down. It was better than ever. Trade was fine. Like laughable things, okay? And then this morning he was like flop sweat posting on Truth Social about how we all just needed to be patient. One of the things that that folks should consider in all of this is that there are some figures inside his inner circle who have incredibly disturbed and fascist aims, who are quite clearly manipulating him to achieve what they want, okay? I think anybody looking at that interview knows that he's not a well man. You can't look at that interview and say, yeah, he's all together, right? At the same time, there's people behind the scenes like Stephen Miller, right? Like Russ Vought, like other white Christo nationalists inside that administration who know that if they praise him and they flatter him and they play to his ego and they fuel his narcissism, they can actually run the show. And I'm just going to point out, I've been talking about this since the first Pete Hegseth chat dropped, since we found out that they had added the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic by mistake, that one of the things that was incredibly clear inside that chat was that Stephen Miller was the one who said, well, I heard the president was okay with bombing Yemen. That's what I heard. I don't think there's really any dispute about that. We literally have no idea whether or not Donald Trump was even aware that those planes were going to be in the air. And all of this deportation stuff, which isn't even really deportation, it's extraordinary rendition. They're now deporting U.S. citizens. All of this is being engineered by Stephen Miller and his ilk with the help of Marco Rubio, right? I saw a joke meme last night on the internet of Marco Rubio's face, official portrait, with like MS-13 photoshopped over his forehead in Arial font. Nonetheless, the internet is funny. Nonetheless, I want people to understand that when he says things like, I'm not in charge of that, which is what he said about his return, trying to return Abrego Garcia. Terry Moran points to the phone on the Resolute desk and says, you could pick up that phone right now and call Bukele and tell him to release Kilmar Abrego Garcia. Why won't you do it? Well, that's not up to me. You're the freaking president of the United States, which is pretty much what Terry Moran said. He said, you're the president, right? Of course he could pick up the phone and do that, but he's not running the show. And that in and of itself is also something that people need to understand, that just like malignant narcissists are targets, right? They can be played by foreign adversaries, for instance. They can also be played by people with much more disturbed aims to get what they want. And so understanding all of this as it comes together is really critical, not just for our own information and our own self-regulation and how we respond to this, but also for the strategic decisions about what we're going to do next. Okay. Again, I have to remind you, I show up here every day and I try to give you guys action steps. One of the things that I just want to remind everybody of is that the case of Kilmer Abrego Garcia cannot leave the front pages. And the ways in which we keep the pressure up on that, and by the way, the pressure on like all of those men who have been unlawfully, extraordinarily rendered to a concentration camp for their release, is by continuing to make our calls to Congress. And I know it's a pain in the ass, but I called Senator Booker yesterday, called him for a totally different reason that I'm going to talk about in a minute, and like gave that team a piece of my mind. And I think that really we cannot forget that if we don't continue to keep the pressure on, this will become normalized. In fact, they're counting on it becoming normalized. The reason why they put up all those photos on the White House lawn of the people they claimed, the quote unquote illegal immigrants that they claimed they had deported, is because they want this kind of harm to be normalized. Just for the same reason that last night in Michigan, when Trump held a rally and they showed a fascist video of the harm and torture and brutality to the men who have been extraordinarily rendered to that concentration camp, and people chanted USA, 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 that is what they are after. And I can tell you one other thing. Trump didn't write that speech. He didn't write that speech. So again, you've got to keep the totality of all of this in mind. And we've got to actually start deciding that there are certain issues on which we will not bow or bend. And, you know, this one is obvious, just completely obvious. Okay. Let's talk for a Senate about a Senate. The reason why I said that is because Senate is the next thing on my list. Let's talk for a second about what's happening in the Senate, because there was a question this morning on the Patreon feed. Reminder, if you want to support this broadcast, ask questions, get access to bonus broadcasts, you can join us over at Patreon a month. One of the questions I was asked was, what do we do about Democrats who continue to vote to confirm Trump nominees? This, my friends, is why I called Cory Booker's office yesterday, because right after that whole event on the steps of the Capitol with Hakeem Jeffries and Santiago Meyer, as we discussed yesterday, Cory Booker went inside and voted for David Perdue to be ascended to his position as a U.S. ambassador. That David Perdue, who was defeated in Georgia, right? No U.S. Democratic senator should be voting in favor of any Trump nominee right now. And one of the things that we have to do is continue relentlessly to put pressure on Democrats who are our elected officials to stop doing things that either tacitly or overtly endorse anything that this administration is doing. And what I said when I called, just in case you guys need a little bit of a script, was I want to thank Senator Booker for his all-night event on the floor of the Senate and for what he did on the steps of the Capitol. And I would also like him to know that people in my town, because this is true, are very confused by the fact that he continues to vote for Trump nominees while he's doing that. Why is he doing that? We don't need centrists. He's not going to gain any additional voters by doing that. We need him to stand up and actually walk the talk. These are the kind of things that you should be saying kind of nonstop when you call, okay? You should be demanding that the senators don't vote for any Trump nominees. You should be expressly asking them what they are doing to try to get Kilmer, Abrego Garcia, and others returned. What are they doing next? How do they plan to get him back? How do they plan to get the others back? Those should be overt questions that you're asking nonstop. The pressure has to stay on. Okay, so that's my 2 cents about that. And the only thing I can tell you is that the speculation is that they think, the Democrats who are doing this think that, and this is speculation, but the Democrats that are doing this think that it makes them look bipartisan, like they're willing to work with the other side. You can't work with fascists. Like, there's literally no legitimate reason for senators on our side of the fence to be voting in favor of Trump nominees. They gain nothing. So, all of this is something that needs to continue to garner our response. And we need to continue making our phone calls, and we need to continue putting on the pressure. Okay. On the returning to the crazy pants front, yesterday, Trump said that he would like to be Pope. And then Lindsay Graham put out, I am not kidding, a legitimate tweet on Twitter, which I still have a really hard time calling X, saying that, of course, Trump should be Pope. Wouldn't it be great to have somebody who was the president and the Pope for the first time in history? Okay. This is one of those moments where I have to remind everybody about shiny objects. As much as I would like the Vatican to take Donald Trump away from our shores, that's not going to happen. And in fact, this whole Pope thing became, and this is, I have to make this distinction very clearly, because there's a bunch of Democrats, like more than a bunch, lots of Democrats these days, sorry, I just kicked over a water bottle, who are getting on the interwebs and saying things like, these deportations are a distraction from the failing economy. The tariffs are a distraction from what they're doing to trans people. The trans persecution movement is a distraction from what's happening, in some other way, okay? The only thing that is a shiny object, and I want to be really clear about this so that none of you go out onto the interwebs and claim things that are like nonsense, because what I just described is nonsense. The only thing that is a shiny object is something that does no overt harm to anyone, that is literally like the squirrel thing from The Dog and Up, or the shiny thing over here that's like, look at this crazy thing that everybody should talk about. Trump should be Pope, right? That is designed for only one purpose, and that is to get people to stop talking about Trump's failing poll numbers, the crashing economy, the impact for hot scarcity summer, which is incoming, which we're going to spend a lot of time talking about going forward, I'm sure. It is designed just to get the internet distracted. And they are relying on all of us to be out there kind of like circulating it, right? I'm going to remind you all that like the way this disinformation gets circulated is not just through the Fox News, News Nation, InfoWars type bubble, but actually through us. And so it is critically important to like see the shiny objects when they arrive and get that they're doing it. Somebody on Blue Sky last night said that what must have happened was that out of the White House came, we need a monkey to dance, because the polling is so bad and this interview was disastrous. Who's going to dance? Lindsay Graham. It's his turn to dance like a monkey. So again, just keep in mind that that they are doing that on purpose, all right? And Trump isn't going to be the frickin' Pope. He's not even Catholic. Not a chance, okay? So we don't have to really worry about it. All right. Somebody asked me a question about the Supreme Court ruling that stayed deportations and why people were continuing to be deported. So I have to explain something to all of you in the fine print of this, okay? Again, I want you to remember that the Supreme Court can only consider cases and controversies that are actually before it. What came before the Supreme Court with that injunction that said stop these deportations was the executive order under the Alien Enemies Act, okay? And they said, nope, you can't deport anyone under this executive order until this case in the Fifth Circuit is resolved, okay? They didn't say all deportations have to stop or no one can be deported. They said you cannot extraordinarily render, essentially, someone off the street, claim that they're an alien enemy, and send them out of the country, okay? So when you're seeing people continuing to be deported, part of the problem with where we are, and I have to remind you all of this, like Biden deported tens of thousands of people. Obama was known in the immigration rights community as the deporter in chief, okay? We have always continuously deported people from this country. The issue right now is that people are being deported without due process by invoking the Alien Enemies Act. And so what SCOTUS stopped was simply those deportations, okay? So again, I mean, you all should know this by now. I think you do if you've been watching for some time. It is incredibly unconstitutional to black bag people off the street and throw them on an airplane, right? But the Alien Enemies Act is the rationale right now that is stayed, okay? Anything else is subject to other orders, okay? So that is the reason why. All right. There was an article written in Dame magazine that one of our trans and non-binary community members raised this morning on the Patreon feed that I want to just mention very briefly. The article was an anonymous article written by a trans, sounds like a trans academic. I have to say that unfortunately, in reading this, I have a very strong suspicion of who this trans academic is, but I'm not going to say their name using my suspicion because they have chosen to remain anonymous in this article in Dame magazine. They are opting to leave the country. They are a parent of non-binary children, and they have written a very articulate explanation many, many thousands of words of why they are opting to leave the country right now. So the question that was asked to me by our trans/non-binary community member, who also shall remain anonymous, was what advice do I have for people who are staying, who are in that community? And where can we find some hope? Okay, so let me just say a couple of things about this. This issue is very personal to me, and I think everybody knows that. I have family members who are in that community, and I will not lie and say that I haven't at my own moment considered whether or not leaving the country for the sake of their safety was an option. I don't think there's anybody who knows and loves somebody who's trans or non-binary, or who is trans or non-binary, who hasn't thought about it as a possibility right now, okay? Because the persecution of the trans and non-binary community by this administration, by Trump and his campaign, by the far right, and unfortunately by the complicity of some centrist Democrats, has made life in this country for that community incredibly difficult. And I don't think we can minimize it, all right? The threats are very real, and they are not nonviolent threats, right? Again, people who are students of history, this particular author has taught about fascist history, know that the persecution of LGBTQ people was a huge part of the Holocaust. So the basis for considering all of this is legitimate. If you do not have the means to leave, I want to give you at least a little bit of hope, okay? Some of the most regressive and abusive policies that this administration has tried to put into place have been stopped in their tracks in the courts, okay? The ACLU Transgender Rights Project, under the helm of the incredible Chase Strangio, huge admiration for his work, first trans lawyer to litigate in front of the Supreme Court. They have done incredible work since January 20th. They've had the ban on trans soldiers in the military stayed. They've had the attempt to transfer trans prisoners into prisons for their assigned gender at birth stopped. And that work continues. It doesn't get a lot of airplay, but it continues. We also have a lot of positive movement in state legislatures. I'm going to remind you all, we talked about this at the time that it was going down, but Representative Zoe Zephyr, who is one of two trans/non-binary representatives now in the Montana legislature, has been just an incredible advocate. And as a result, Republicans, literally dozens of Republicans in the Montana legislature, have voted down anti-trans legislation in Montana. So there is hope for movement. There is hope for resistance. There is pushback from the courts and pushback in legislatures. And that's really, really, really good, right? The other thing that I just want to say here that I think is really important is that I think it's on all of us to think about how we can create safety for members of the trans and non-binary community right now. Maybe that means a donation to the Trevor Project, which is an organization that helps to prevent trans, non-binary, and LGBTQ youth suicide. They are a life-saving organization. I did my birthday fundraiser last year for them. You should donate to them as often as you can. Human Rights Campaign does incredible work on behalf of the LGBTQ community and trans folks as well, obviously, as a part of their work. You can make donations. You can show up to support the trans community when legislation is pending that would harm them. And also, you can do your part to be in community, right? Show up at organizations where you live that are doing work to benefit the LGBTQ community. Go to Pride festivals, because by the way, this year, there's a lot of nonsense going on around Pride. We need people who are cishet or cis to show up on behalf of our trans and non-binary siblings to make sure that they know they are safe and supported, okay? It's more important now than ever that we make our support visible if we are cishet or if we are cis, okay? That support should not be assumed, because by the way, there's a lot of other really, really bad shit going down in the United Kingdom right now about this, led in part by J.K. Rowling. Please, I'm going to beg you all, do not give that woman any more money. Don't buy the books. Don't watch the movies. She is on a campaign of violence against trans and non-binary people in the UK, and it's working. Unfortunately, it's working. So we have to do literally everything that we can to offer visible support, financial support, emotional support, safety support, wherever we can for trans and non-binary people. And so, that's a long rant. Again, this is like personal to me and it really matters. But the one thing I just want to remind you all of is that it is a very, very scary time for our trans and non-binary sibs. And the hope that I want to give today is that everyone in this community will do your part to stand up, because again, it only takes 3.5% of a given population to create widespread societal change. And we cannot neglect the persecution, the abuse of our trans and non-binary sibs, and our obligation is to keep people safe. I'm also just going to point out, one of the things that I'm really, really bothered about right now is all this stuff about trans girls in sports, because there's like a tiny, tiny fraction of trans girls in sports in this country, like an absolutely minuscule number. The New York Times Magazine did a profile last weekend of one of them, and how she, with her teammates and her coach and people on the other side who she was playing, who all knew she was trans, had no problem with it until one parent stormed onto a volleyball court and decided that she had to be trans. And, she wasn't really out beyond like her immediate friends and family and her team and her coach. But it talks about what it was like for her to be thrust into the center of that. Okay. And it is, I think, one of the things that is so dangerous is that, just in the same way that the far right has been incredibly good about messaging specifically to people through platforms like Facebook with micro-targeted messaging that gives people things that hit them in places where they know they're going to be able to be emotionally manipulated, this argument that somehow our cis daughters are going to be harmed by trans girls in sports has unfortunately led some women of my generation to decide that this is a real issue when it's not. And, by the way, to also fall prey to this thing of like I just unfortunately saw Mickey Sherrill doing a debate about this last night in New Jersey for the gubernatorial race, where she was like, we should just ignore this. And unfortunately, we can't ignore it, right? Like, it would be nice, I suppose, if you could kind of like ignore the whole issue and it would go away. But that's like head in the sand kind of garbage, right? As opposed to what the mayor of Newark, New Jersey said in the debate last night, which was, we're holding a rally in support of our trans neighbors. And I'm going to invite every other gubernatorial candidate on the stage to show up. And we'll see then who really walks the talk. That's the kind of energy we have to bring to this. Like, be loud, be energetic, be like positively supportive, and be the hope that members of our own community are asking for. Okay? Like, it's just, we can't let this slide. And I want to make sure that members of our own community, as well as like everybody who's trans and non-binary in this country, knows that there are more of us than there are of them in terms of like the people who support. And that in and of itself will create hope. Okay. I'll probably have a lot more to say about that as we go forward, because I tend to talk about it kind of at length whenever it comes up. All right. Good news today, because I wanted to leave you guys with some like final really good news. Okay. Mohsen Madawi, who was one of the Colombia protesters, who is here on a legal green card. It's really hard for me not to get angry about this. And walked into an interview for his naturalization, meaning like he was on the verge of becoming a U.S. citizen. He showed up for his naturalization interview. He qualified in every other respect and was arrested and detained by ICE, was released just an hour ago on an order of a Vermont federal judge. The Vermont federal judge said, you have no basis to detain him. There's no reason why he should be in an ICE detention facility. You have to let him go. And he walked out of that courthouse. And the first thing that he said, God, I love like student protesters. Oh my God, I used to be one. The first thing that he said was, I want to be absolutely clear to President Trump and his cabinet. I am not afraid of you. So the reason why I wanted to end with that was not only because it's very good news, and it is an enormous loss to the Trump administration, like an enormous loss, because where they started initially was to say, we're going to incarcerate people who are here legally because we don't like their speech. And we're going to use anti-Semitism as a wedge to claim that it's okay for us to do that. They have lost this, and not just lost it, but like lost it in a humiliating fashion. Now, that doesn't mean that Madawi's not going to have to present that he deserves to be a U.S. citizen, because he's going to get his due process, but he's free. right now. He's free. Okay. One of the things that I just want to remind you all of here, and this is something that like we really have to kind of continue to hang on to, is that Trump is losing over and over and over again in the federal courts. And this example in particular is one where he has lost on the fascist immigration policies in a really flamingly visible way. Okay. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that there is some footage circulating around this morning of a drone from, I think it was Reuters or AP, that was flying over a detention facility in Texas, which is currently housing Venezuelan men who are afraid that they are about to be deported to CCOT in El Salvador. And as the drone was flying over it yesterday, these men in their concentration camp uniforms lined up in the yard to form the letters SOS. These are men, by the way, who, like, you know, in many of these facilities are being starved. They're being housed in icebox rooms. They're not being given medical care. Okay. So I got to point something out to everybody in this audience. And I need to say this, okay? Because yesterday in one of our training programs for the Ripple Effect Institute, something came up where a number of the incredible organizers and activists that we're working with in that program, by the way, if you want to get in on it, I will drop a link above when I'm done over here about how you can sign up for a free strategy call if you want to learn more about it with me. Okay. But one of the things that came up in there was that a number of our organizers and impact builders are getting requests from white people that are saying, like, I don't know where to start. And I'm actually kind of scared about like getting out into the streets right now or showing up for a meeting. And I'm not sure what to do. Okay. Well, first and foremost, if that's you, I'm just going to say this: go to mobilize.us and find an event and go. All right. Like, you can do that work yourself, and you really should. Okay. But the second thing I'm going to say about it is this: if a man who was detained in an ICE detention facility for simply exercising his freedom of speech can walk out of a courthouse this morning and look into dozens of cameras and say, I have a message for President Trump and his cabinet, I am not afraid of you. If men who are already in a concentration camp in Texas can line up in their prison uniforms in defiance of all the violence and harm that they are experiencing there to make out the letters SOS in the hope that a drone from one of the major news agencies sees them, if they can do that, what's stopping you? Seriously, what's stopping you from showing up? Because I will tell you right now that one of the things that I struggle with when I sit here every day and I talk to kind of like thousands of you is how many people I know are not actually yet taking action. And how many white folks in particular refuse to take action because they're afraid of being persecuted. Okay. There are no more kind of solid rationales for not getting involved. And this, by the way, is also a moment where white people really need to put their bodies on the line, because Black and brown people have been doing it for centuries. And it's a good moment to kind of like get out into the streets with reliable organizers and make your voice heard. Show up and, you know, do the right thing. Okay. Show up and get involved. Get involved with your local immigrant rights organization. Get involved with your local organization that protects trans and non-binary people. Get involved in your local community and how you're going to do protection work. Okay. If they can do it, if a person who literally was on the verge of being deported to a concentration camp in El Salvador can walk out of court and say, I am not afraid of you, I don't really think the rest of us have any excuses. So that's where I am leaving you today. Okay. Reminder that you can get our guide on how to lead without burning out. I'm going to drop that into the comments section. It's also in the show notes for this. That's free, and it will teach you how to do everything you need to know to organize your community without like losing your mind. And also, please don't forget to subscribe here, like this broadcast. If you like what we're doing here, drop us a comment if you like our broadcast, because it tells the algorithm that you like what we're doing here. And I will catch you all here tomorrow at regular time. All right. Take care, everybody. I hope you have a great day. And I know this broadcast was kind of all over the place, but we had a lot to cover. All right. I will see you here at regular time tomorrow. Thanks, everyone. Bye.